In the shadows of the Great Depression, as America's banks collapsed and trust in the dollar disintegrated, a quiet experiment began, one that could have changed the financial history of the United States forever. It wasn't gold, it wasn't silver, it wasn't even paper money as people knew it. It was something radically different, an idea so dangerous, so revolutionary, that it threatened to undermine the Federal Reserve itself. This is the forgotten story of the currency that almost replaced the US dollar. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, the American economy imploded. Banks closed overnight. People lost their savings. Factories shut down, farms went bankrupt, and millions found themselves without work. In that chaos, something fundamental broke: the nation's faith in money itself. The US dollar, once a symbol of strength and prosperity, had become a source of fear. But in this darkness, a small group of economists, engineers, and idealists began searching for a better way. They asked a dangerous question. What if money didn't have to come from banks? What if communities could create their own money? Money based not on gold, not on government, but on trust and work. The idea wasn't new. Throughout history, when traditional currencies failed, societies had created their own substitutes. During the early 1930s, these were called scrips, community currencies printed by towns, factories, even schools. Thousands of them appeared across America. Local governments paid their workers in them, businesses accepted them, families traded them for food and essentials. It was an underground financial revolution, small, scattered, and improvised. But one experiment stood above them all. It happened in a small mountain town in the Midwest in a place called Ithaca, Kansas, a town that decided to take money into its own hands. The story began with a mayor named Clarence Rumsey. He was no banker, no economist, just a man trying to save his community from collapse. The local banks had closed, credit had vanished, and people were bartering chickens for bread. So Rumsey gathered his town council and proposed something extraordinary. "We have no money," he said, "but we still have people. We still have work. So let's create a currency that reflects that." Within weeks, the town printed its own notes, simple pieces of paper marked Ithaca Hour. Each note represented 1 hour of work. Farmers accepted it, shopkeepers used it, teachers were paid in it. To everyone's surprise, it worked. The town came back to life. People who had been idle began producing again. The local economy started to breathe. Word spread fast. By 1933, dozens of other towns across the United States were experimenting with similar systems: labor dollars, energy certificates, local exchange notes. The movement caught the attention of intellectuals and even some government officials. One of them was Irving Fisher, a Yale economist and one of the most brilliant monetary thinkers of the early 20th century. Fisher had lost much of his fortune in the 1929 crash. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, how the traditional banking system had failed ordinary Americans. When he learned about the community currencies emerging across the country, he saw in them not chaos, but potential. He began studying the experiments closely, gathering data and statistics, and what he discovered astonished him. Communities using local currencies recovered faster than those relying solely on the US dollar. Unemployment dropped, trade resumed. It was as if money had returned to its true purpose, a tool for exchange, not a weapon of debt. By 1933, Fisher began to openly advocate for a national version of this new kind of money, a government-backed currency that could circulate alongside the dollar based on work and production rather than debt. He called it stamp scrip. It was simple but ingenious. Each note had to be stamped every week to remain valid. The cost of the stamp, just a few cents, acted as a kind of negative interest rate, forcing money to circulate instead of being hoarded. In a world where everyone was clinging desperately to every dollar, Fisher's idea encouraged spending, not saving. It kept money moving and economies alive. It was, in essence, a self-lubricating currency system, one that punished stagnation and rewarded activity. And it worked. Several towns tried Fisher's stamp scrip, and almost all saw immediate improvement. Employment rose, production increased, confidence returned. But success brought attention, and attention brought power. Soon, word of these local currencies reached Washington. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had just taken office. He was preparing to launch his New Deal, a sweeping plan to rescue the American economy through massive government intervention. His advisors heard about the stamp scrip movement and were intrigued. Some saw it as a tool that could jumpstart local economies. Others saw it as a threat to federal authority. The U.S. government was fighting to restore faith in its own currency, the dollar. If dozens of local currencies were circulating freely, each with its own system, how could the government control inflation, taxation, or national monetary policy? There were whispers in Washington that if Fisher's stamp scrip succeeded on a large scale, it could undermine the Federal Reserve entirely. And then came the crucial moment. In the spring of 1933, Fisher presented his ideas directly to officials in Washington. He proposed a temporary national issue of stamp scrip backed by the government to stimulate demand and employment. He was persuasive. He had data, he had proof that it worked. For a brief moment, it seemed the United States might actually adopt this parallel currency. Newspapers across the country reported that the Treasury was studying Fisher's proposal. Some towns even delayed issuing their own scripts, waiting to see what Washington would decide. But behind closed doors, the resistance was fierce. Bankers warned that allowing alternative currencies would destroy confidence in the dollar. Federal Reserve officials argued that such a system would make it impossible to manage the national money supply. Even within Roosevelt's cabinet, opinions were divided. The Secretary of the Treasury, William Woodin, was sympathetic to Fisher's ideas, but many others were not. And so, after weeks of debate, the decision came down. In May 1933, the government announced that all forms of local and private currencies would be banned. Only the U.S. dollar issued by the Federal Reserve would be legal tender. Within days, Fisher's dream was dead. Local currencies were seized or quietly abandoned. The Treasury even sent agents to towns still printing scrip to shut them down. In one swift move, the forgotten currency that had almost replaced the dollar was erased from history. But the story doesn't end there. Though Fisher's proposal was rejected, his ideas did not disappear. They inspired economists and reformers across the world. In Europe, several nations experimented with stamp scrip during the 1930s. In Germany, one small town named Wörgl used a system nearly identical to Fisher's, and the results were miraculous. Unemployment dropped to zero. Public works projects flourished. The town thrived, until the central bank intervened and banned the currency. The same pattern repeated again and again. Wherever these community currencies appeared, they brought recovery and hope. And wherever they succeeded, central authorities moved quickly to suppress them. Why? Because money, at its core, is not just a tool of trade, it's a tool of control. Whoever controls the creation of money controls the direction of society. If people could create their own money, money that worked without banks or central oversight, the very foundation of modern finance would collapse. Credit, interest, monetary policy, all of it depends on one principle: that money must be scarce and centralized. Fisher's stamp scrip was the opposite. It was decentralized, abundant, and self-regulating. It was money that served people, not power, and that made it unacceptable. After his proposal was rejected, Irving Fisher continued to write and teach, but he never again tried to reform the monetary system so radically. He died in 1947, largely forgotten, his revolutionary idea buried beneath decades of economic orthodoxy. Yet in recent years, his work has been rediscovered by historians and economists. Some even argue that Fisher was a century ahead of his time, that his stamp scrip was a primitive form of what we now call demurrage-based currency, or even a philosophical ancestor of digital community money. Today, when we speak of local currencies, digital tokens, or blockchain-based systems, we're echoing the same question Fisher asked in 1933. Can money exist without banks? Can value be measured by work and trust instead of debt and control? The United States answered no nearly a century ago. But as financial crises continue to shake the world, Fisher's question refuses to die. The forgotten currency that almost replaced the dollar was never about pieces of paper or stamps. It was about something far deeper: the right of people to define value for themselves. It failed, not because it didn't work, but because it worked too well. And perhaps someday, in another era of crisis and collapse, someone will rediscover that idea again. The belief that money can be created not by decree, but by cooperation. Until then, it remains one of history's great what-ifs, the currency that almost replaced the US dollar. Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, be sure to subscribe and hit that bell icon for more forgotten histories.